Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the deep dive. Before we jump in, we really have to frame this conversation with our source material. For this deep dive, we're relying heavily on Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir's incredible work, The Foundation of Islamic Jurisprudence. Specifically, we're in Volume 1, Subvolume 3, which is all about the foundational jurisprudence from the time of Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab. May God be pleased with him. And for all of you joining us on the AI Era Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom channel, thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot. Please, if you get a chance, subscribe to the channel and, like the video. And of course, if you find this interesting, please share this deep dive with your friends, especially anyone who's into this kind of deep constitutional and historical analysis. So our mission today is to unpack a really foundational case study, what you'd call emergency governance. We're looking at a moment where a lawful state, still quite young, faced a total collapse. I mean, environmental, societal, everything. And it had to make these huge constitutional decisions under incredible duress.
This is all about the leadership of Hazrat Umar during a period history now it calls al-Ramādah, the Year of Ashes.
And it's so important that we start by grasping the sheer scale of this crisis. You have to understand this to see why the legal steps that followed were so radical. We're talking about the year 18 AH, that's 639 CE on the Common Calendar. And when you hear the word famine, you might think of, a bad harvest, food shortages. This was something else entirely. It was exponentially worse. The sources describe a complete environmental catastrophe, not just a drought. The rain just stopped. It failed.
Completely failed.
Completely. And so the crops withered, livestock started dying en masse. It was a total system collapse.
And that name, al-Ramādah, the Year of Ashes, it's so visceral. It's not just a poetic title, is it? It's a literal description of what the land looked like.
It is, exactly. The sources say the land literally turned a sterile, desolate gray color. It was covered in this fine dust that was like ash. So this wasn't just an economic downturn. It was an existential threat. It was an event that threatened to completely wipe out entire communities, especially those around Medina who relied on farming and pastoral life.
And this is exactly where the story pivots. It goes from being a story about a natural disaster to a masterclass in constitutional law. You have this state, which is founded on very specific principles of Sharia, of structured law, and suddenly its entire legal framework is under a kind of pressure it was never designed for.
Right. The system that worked perfectly well in peacetime was suddenly not just unhelpful. It was potentially harmful. It was incapable of protecting life.
So that's the dilemma.
That's the core dilemma that Umar had to face, and it's why this deep dive is so critical. The question was, and it's a timeless one, how does a lawful state maintain its legitimacy, its rule of law, when the normal application of that very law is threatening to make things worse, to increase the death toll?
It's the ultimate test of authority.
The ultimate test.
Yeah.
It required absolute decisiveness, but at the same time, it required upholding the foundational principles of mercy and justice. He needed to be flexible enough to save lives, but not so flexible that the state just dissolved into, arbitrary tyrannical rule.
That sounds like an impossible tightrope to walk.
Yeah.
You almost have to break the law to save the spirit of the law.
Or you have to modify the enforcement of the law to uphold the purpose of the law. And that's the key. The purpose of Islamic law, of any just law, really, is to preserve life, maintain order, and deliver justice.
And when enforcing a legal formality starts to lead to cruelty or death,
then the system has failed. A just legal system must have some kind of inherent mechanism for self-correction. What Umar did was find that mechanism and apply it on a statewide scale.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's really dig into this scale of this breakdown, Section 1. The crisis and the legal breakdown. You mentioned it went beyond hunger. What were some of the human details from the sources that showed just how desperate things got?
The human cost was just extreme. The sources paint this picture of physiological collapse. We're told that people's faces turned pale, not just thin from hunger, but literally drained of color.
Matching the ash of the land.
Exactly. It indicates this severe chronic malnutrition and dehydration spreading across the entire population. We see families just forced to abandon their homes their entire lives just to search for anything to eat. The whole structure of settled life began to unravel.
And the social safety nets that would normally kick in?
They were completely frayed. Those were mostly localized, tribal or community-based. But they frayed because there was simply nothing left to share. Everyone was in the same boat.
So you have mass displacement, a total failure of the food supply. The entire support system for life just vanishes. And when that happens, the legal and social structures are always the next to go.
Precisely. Which brings us right to the constitutional problem this created. Any legal framework, it hinges on a stable society where people can generally make free moral choices.
Right.
The famine just shattered that assumption. When survival becomes the only imperative, the legal structure doesn't just bend, it threatens to shred itself completely.
So what were the specific consequences?
Mm,
The sources must detail how this moral conflict played out on the ground.
they do. First, and most obviously, theft just exploded. But people weren't stealing out of greed. They were stealing to keep their children alive.
A crime of desperation.
A crime of necessity. Second, the entire system of contracts failed. Imagine you're a farmer who promised to deliver a harvest or repay a debt. That becomes impossible. So you have widespread legal disputes, bankruptcies.
And the markets.
The markets distorted wildly. Scarcity created this perfect storm for hoarding. So a few people with stockpiles could become incredibly wealthy, while the vast majority were left with nothing.
Which leads to the most painful legal problem of all, the punishment system itself. It becomes tainted, doesn't it? If the law says you have to impose a severe penalty for theft, but the thief is starving, the state is put in an impossible moral position.
That is the foundational conflict. You have the established legal code on one side and the immediate, desperate necessity of life on the other. If the state rigidly enforces the law, it's committing an injustice. It's punishing people for being victims of a catastrophe.
And that costs lives and destroys public trust.
Exactly. But if it just suspends all law, it invites total chaos, which also costs lives and leads to the collapse of the state. Umar had to find a third path.
And that's the whole idea of the injustice of blind enforcement. It's the difference between a mechanical, robotic application of the law and a truly judicious one.
Right. If you just apply the letter of the law without considering the context, you might be technically correct, but you're morally bankrupt.
Yeah.
And that was the defining insight of his response.
To enforce the ODUD, the fixed penalties.
Yes, enforcing the sudude for theft, which could involve amputation, would have been a catastrophic moral error. Umar understood that the crime didn't come from malice. It wasn't a rejection of morality. It came from absolute necessity.
In Islamic jurisprudence, there's a term for this, right?
Yes, darura.
Yeah.
It means compulsion or necessity. The principle is that if an individual is compelled by an imminent threat of death, then the prerequisite for applying the full force of the law, which is free moral choice, is fundamentally absent.
So the state can't justly punish someone for a choice they didn't really have. That's a profound statement about the limits of state power.
It is, but you can imagine the challenge. Many governors or jurists might have argued, well, if we suspend the law for this one crime, what stops the whole system from collapsing?
Anarchy, the slippery slope argument.
Exactly. And if Umar had just said, we're ignoring the law, he would have signaled weakness and encouraged opportunism. But he didn't do that. He made a targeted, incredibly nuanced legal intervention.
How so?
His stance was essentially this. You stole because you were starving, and the state, my government, failed to ensure you weren't starving. Therefore, the state cannot, in good conscience, punish you for its own failure.
Wow, so it places a portion of the legal fault back onto the system itself for failing in its duty to protect its citizens.
Precisely. And this targeted approach preserved the state's legitimacy. He didn't suspend the penalties for, say, murder or for malicious property damage. He focused only on survival crimes. The solution was legal, not anarchic. And that required moving into this new territory of legal innovation.
Okay, so let's move into that. Section 2, legal innovation. How did he actually build the legal justification for overriding these fixed penalties? What was the foundational principle?
The core idea he established was a very clear hierarchy of legal priorities. He declared that when survival is threatened, the preservation of life takes absolute overriding priority over the application of punishment. This wasn't just a political move, it was a profound declaration of legal philosophy.
Let's unpack that a bit. Why was that so revolutionary, especially when you think about the other legal systems of the time, like the Roman or Persian traditions?
Well, in many of those classical legal systems, law was often seen as this rigid command structure. It came from the monarch or from the gods, and your job was to comply. Context was secondary. Umar's principle completely flipped that. It stated that the law, which is derived from divine guidance, is fundamentally intended to secure human welfare, the maqasid al-Sharia, the higher objectives of the law.
So if the fixed penalty, in the specific context of a famine, actually undermines that higher goal of preserving life,
then the enforcement mechanism has to yield. It establishes that law must serve life, not the other way around. You don't sacrifice people to uphold the letter of the law.
the intent behind the law is more important than the literal text of the penalty.
Yes. And that immediately opened the door for the most famous administrative action of the whole crisis, the suspension of hudud punishments for theft.
This is the big aha moment for anyone studying this period.
It really is. The specific action was the suspension of the enforcement of those fixed penalties. And it's so important to be clear here. Hudud are the specific, severe punishments outlined in the foundational texts. Suspending them meant that the standard penalty of, say, hand amputation was not applied to starving people who stole food.
But you stressed this wasn't an abolition of the law itself. How did he maintain the law's integrity while pulling its main tooth, so to speak?
That's the legal genius of it. Theft was still a prohibited act. It was still wrong. A person who stole might still be required to, pay restitution if they could, or maybe face a discretionary, less severe penalty called tazir.
Okay.
But the mandatory maximum punishment was removed. Why? Because the legal condition of darura, of necessity, was present. By saying punishment without choice is injustice, Umar was actually utilizing a principle that already existed within the broader legal framework, that compulsion negates full liability, and he just applied it universally to a state-level emergency.
That must have taken immense administrative courage. He was essentially saying the state is partially responsible for the circumstances of the crime.
He was. And the suspension was temporary. It was tied directly to the observable conditions of the famine. It was a context-sensitive application of justice. It protected the needy from being legally victimized twice, once by the famine and again by the legal system.
Which keeps the state from becoming an instrument of oppression in the name of technicality.
Exactly. It allows the legal system to breathe compassion and actually uphold its duty.
Okay, but this brings us to the political elephant in the room. Defining emergency powers without them being abused. If a ruler can suspend a fixed, severe law because he says there's a crisis, what's to stop him from just declaring a crisis whenever he wants and suspending all rights to become an autocrat?
That is the definitive constitutional litmus test. It's what separates true leadership from tyranny. And what kept Umar's actions legitimate was the presence of strict, self-imposed, and publicly known limits on his use of these extraordinary powers.
The power was for one purpose only.
To save lives, not to consolidate his own control. That was the singular focus.
So what were those constraints? What, according to the sources, defined this legitimate use of emergency power?
The constraints were crystal clear, and they were vital to his legitimacy. First, there was no confiscation of private property. Even in this massive crisis, foundational economic rights were respected. He mobilized the state's reserves, not the private wealth of ordinary people.
Okay, that's huge.
Huge. Second, there was no forced displacement. People were encouraged to move to relief centers, sure, but there were no mass deportations or arbitrary population movements under military force.
So no martial law, basically.
Right. Third, no arbitrary punishments. The emergency powers didn't give the government a blank check to jail political opponents or enforce random ad hoc laws. The due process system for non-famine-related crimes remained intact.
And what about speech? What about dissent?
And this is the most critical one. There was no suppression of complaint or dissent. The channels for public accountability remained open. People could question, even challenge, how relief was being distributed without fearing for their lives.
So the action was like a surgical strike. It was targeted only at the survival-driven crime of theft, while the structural pillars of a free society, property rights, due process, freedom of complaint, remained standing.
That is the critical distinction. His emergency power was temporary, targeted, and accountable. It had a clear trigger, the famine, and a clear endpoint, the end of the famine. An authoritarian ruler uses a crisis to make temporary power permanent. A legitimate emergency governor uses power only to solve the crisis and then steps back. That's what preserved the long-term trust in the state.
Right, which brings us to the actual response. Suspending punishment deals with the symptom, but the root cause is starvation. So, Section 3, the state as lifeline. The sources describe this incredible transformation of the Beit al-Mal, the public treasury, into what sounds like a national emergency command center.
It was a radical operational shift. In normal times, the Beit al-Mal is, it's a treasury. It handles state salaries, infrastructure projects, military funding, standard stuff. But during the Year of Ashes, it became the logistical heart of the entire relief effort. This immediate centralization was a signal that the crisis required a unified, coordinated, resource-heavy response that the normal decentralized systems just couldn't handle.
The state had to change its identity.
It had to transform from being a mere administrator of laws and taxes into the primary immediate lifeline for every single citizen.
And the specific actions he took with the Treasury, they must have been incredibly disruptive to the normal running of the government.
They were revolutionary. First, the immediate and massive release of Treasury reserves. We're not talking about a small budget allocation. This was essentially emptying the vaults of cash, of grain, of any non-perishable goods, and converting them directly into survival assets.
And then came the reprioritization.
Absolute reprioritization. He instituted a policy where food and life-saving necessities came before everything else. If a budget item didn't feed the hungry or maintain basic security, it was halted.
So things like big construction projects.
All suspended, deferred military salaries for soldiers who were already fed, any kind of expansionary state activity, all of it was put on hold. Every single dinar was redirected toward relief.
And finally, they set up a centralized distribution system.
Yes, completely bypassing the broken market mechanisms for basic survival needs. Local distribution centers were set up, and food was given out based on verifiable need, not on who you were or how much money you had.
I want to linger on that for a second. Turning the Beit al-Mal into a command center requires more than just political will. It needs real logistical capability. What was it about that structure that made it work so well for rapid mobilization?
That's an excellent question. I think it comes down to two things: existing infrastructure and accountability. Even though governance was decentralized in peacetime, the Beit al-Mal already had reliable chains of communication and personnel in all the provinces for collecting taxes.
So he just flipped the switch.
He just inverted the flow. Instead of personnel sending tax revenue in, they were now tasked with pushing relief supplies out and coordinating local distribution. And because the Beit al-Mal was already accountable to the Caliph and the public, it was less susceptible to the kind of corruption you see when you hastily form new ad hoc relief committees. He used the state's existing fiscal integrity to carry out its emergency duty.
Which brings us to the next logical step. It wasn't enough to just empty the coffers in Medina. The scale of the crisis meant he had to bring in outside help. Inter-provincial resource mobilization.
Absolutely. And this is where another massive constitutional principle was established. This was a flat-out refusal to allow regional abundance to coexist with starvation in the heartland. Umar essentially declared that in a crisis this big, the state is one body. Suffering in one part is suffering for the whole.
So who are the lifelines? Where did the aid come from, and what was the scale of this transfer? It must have been an unbelievable logistical challenge for the 7th century.
The orders went out to the governors of the most stable and agriculturally productive provinces. We're talking Egypt, under the famous Amir ibn al-As, Syria, and Iraq. And the scale was monumental. There's that famous account from Amir ibn al-As in Egypt. He dispatched a column of supplies so long that it was described as being continuous from Egypt all the way to Medina.
Wow.
It was this vast quantity of grain, flour, oil, dried goods, and it was transported by both overland camel caravans and, crucially, by sea, which was a major operation.
Moving thousands of tons of food across deserts and oceans with 7th century logistics. I mean, what were the risks involved in diverting all those resources?
The risks were high. You're diverting so much that those wealthier provinces might start to see shortages or inflation themselves. Politically, you're asking your governors to ignore their own local interests and obey a central command that puts solidarity first.
So the whole thing hinged on the legitimacy of the Caliph.
Entirely. On his perceived legitimacy and the functional efficiency of this new supply chain he was creating on the fly. But the constitutional principle it established was undeniable. In a crisis, provinces are not competitors, they are mandatory lifelines. This action forged the political and ethical unity of the entire state through humanitarian action.
Okay, but even with external supplies coming in, you still have the problem of the local markets, market intervention. When survival goods are scarce, markets can get predatory.
That's the tragic reality of scarcity. The famine led to immediate, rampant hoarding. Prices were skyrocketing. Merchants who had stockpiles could basically hold the population hostage. To just let the free market run its course in that environment would have been a death sentence for anyone who wasn't wealthy.
So what was Umar's intervention? How did he curb the exploitation?
His response was swift and definitive. He prioritized moral necessity over any kind of economic formality. It was a three-pronged intervention. 1. Hoarding was absolutely prohibited and penalized. The message was clear. Holding necessary goods off the market to artificially inflate prices was an act of moral violence against the community. 2. Emergency price stabilization was enforced. This was a form of temporary price control on essential foods to keep them within reach of the average family. It put a cap on how much merchants could exploit the situation. And 3. Profiteering was publicly and morally condemned. He used his platform to create social pressure, reminding merchants that their duty in a shared catastrophe was social responsibility, not self-enrichment.
It's a fascinating tension, isn't it? The state is bending the law to save the starving thief, but it's enforcing the law with an iron fist against the greedy merchant.
It is, and that's what we mean by emergency economic justice. It shows that while the law needs to be flexible when dealing with individual necessity, with the Rura, it must be rigid when confronting systemic exploitation, what would be called zulm, or oppression.
The flexibility is for the victim. The rigidity is for the opportunist.
Precisely. The state's power was leveraged to restore a moral order to the marketplace. It was a declaration that the state's duty to protect life extends deep into the economic sphere.
Which all hinges on the moral authority of the leader. And that brings us to Section 4, Moral and Fiscal Leadership by Example. Let's start with how the aid was distributed. Universal, need-based welfare. How did Umar's team make sure this massive influx of aid was distributed fairly? That it didn't just go to his own tribe or supporters?
His mandate on this was radically inclusive. It basically redefined the scope of state responsibility. The aid was distributed on a need-based principle, and it overrode everything else. Identity, tribe, religion, social status, none of it mattered. This was a constitutional declaration in action. The state serves all residents who face an existential threat within its borders.
And the sources are specific about who the recipients were.
They're very clear. The relief was dispensed universally. The recipients included Muslims and non-Muslims alike, travelers who were just passing through, residents of Medina who weren't Muslim.
Right.
It didn't matter. It included widows, orphans, the elderly, the disabled. It was a comprehensive social safety net.
And that functional declaration of this policy, the treasury belongs to everyone who is hungry, that's just an incredible statement of a state's duty.
It's the ultimate expression of constitutional welfare. It says that in a crisis, the Beit al-Mal isn't a state savings account. It's a dedicated safety net managed by the state to protect the fundamental right to survival for everyone. It moved beyond any kind of tribal or religious exclusivity to just address basic human need.
But that high moral ground has to be held by the leader himself. Which brings us to the most powerful part of the story for many people. Leadership by sacrifice.
Indeed. When your people are enduring a catastrophe, a ruler living in comfort instantly loses all legitimacy. Umar's response wasn't just symbolic. It was a real commitment to shared physical hardship. His pledge was famous. He vowed not to eat meat or fat or ghee. He would eat only the most basic food course, bread and oil, until the crisis was over. He was absolutely determined not to live better than the poorest, most desperate citizen.
Just imagine the psychological impact of that. The ruler of the entire state is willingly eating the same meager rations as his people. That's not just empathy, it's a complete moral alignment with them.
It's the highest form of leadership legitimacy. When the people see their leader voluntarily sharing their physical pain, they are infinitely more likely to trust the policies he's putting in place, no matter how severe they are.
It preempts the anger and mistrust.
It does. The shared suffering stops rebellion before it can even start. His own physical condition became a testament to his moral authority. It proved he understood the true cost of the famine. And that's what allowed the severe interventions, like the market controls, to be accepted as necessary for survival, not as arbitrary impositions from a distant ruler.
And this moral foundation then extends into the state's finances. The suspension of normal revenue demands. It must have been so tempting, with the treasury empty, to just double down on tax collection.
Of course. But the fiscal ethics here were rooted in a very simple ethical assessment. Extracting revenue from the starving is cruelty, not governance. The state recognized that demanding taxes from people who had lost literally everything, their crops, their animals, their entire livelihood, would be an act of systemic violence.
So what were the specific actions they took on the fiscal side?
The measures were very pragmatic and humane. Tax demands, like the zakat on produce that didn't exist anymore, were reduced or suspended entirely. Collection deadlines for any other outstanding debts owed to the state were delayed indefinitely. And most importantly, any form of coercive recovery was strictly forbidden. You couldn't send guards to take someone's last goat for a tax debt.
So the state chose to run a deficit, to suffer budgetary shortages, rather than inflict more suffering on its own people.
Exactly. Fiscal restraint became an ethical imperative. The survival of the individual was placed above the immediate budgetary health of the state, and that just reinforced the message that the government's purpose is to protect, and its own needs are secondary during a catastrophe.
Okay, one last piece of this leadership puzzle. In a situation of extreme chaos, rumor and fear can be just as deadly as starvation. How did Umar use public communication and transparency to manage that collective anxiety?
Communication wasn't an afterthought. It was a central part of building resilience. His strategy was based on radical openness. First, there was a public and honest acknowledgement of how bad the crisis was. No sugarcoating. He told people the truth. Second, he gave a clear, ongoing explanation of all the emergency measures being taken, why the laws were being suspended, why the markets were being controlled, where the aid was coming from. He told people why these unprecedented steps were necessary.
And crucially, he kept the feedback channels open.
Absolutely. He maintained an open invitation for complaints and feedback. He didn't just push information out. He maintained a two-way channel of accountability.
Why was that part so vital? Allowing complaints in the middle of a crisis.
Because it prevented panic and rumor from metastasizing into rebellion. If people felt they had a voice, if they had a way to correct errors in the food distribution, which will always happen in a huge operation like this, they retain trust in the system. When you close down communication, fear and conspiracy fill the vacuum. Transparency and accountability, combined with the shared hardship, were the most effective tools for keeping society together.
An incredible response.
Yeah.
But the final test of constitutional governance is always the exit strategy, Section 5, the masterclass and contemporary relevance. Let's talk about the restoration of normal law.
This is maybe the most difficult challenge for any leader who has tasted that kind of extraordinary power. The legitimacy of emergency rule depends entirely on it being temporary. And as soon as the conditions changed, the moment the rains finally returned, the crops began to stabilize, the food shortages receded, Umar immediately began the process of de-escalation. He started dismantling the temporary emergency structure he had built.
So what were the specific markers that signaled things were going back to normal?
There were three immediate restorations. One, normal taxation resumed. This was a signal that the fiscal health of the citizens was strong enough again for them to fulfill their obligations to the state. Two, Hudud enforcement returned. The legal basis for the suspension, that absolute necessity, darura, was gone. Free moral choice was back on the table, and so the full legal penalties were restored to maintain social order. And three, the markets normalized. The emergency price controls and the strict prohibitions on hoarding were relaxed, allowing the regular economy to function again under standard oversight.
And the crucial takeaway is that he didn't let the crisis become the new normal. He didn't use a public health emergency as an excuse to maintain permanent state control.
Absolutely not. And that's the non-negotiable constitutional rule here. Emergency powers must end when the emergency ends. To cling to them after the threat is gone transforms protection into oppression. And it destroys the very trust that those emergency actions were designed to preserve. The immediate, verifiable return to normal law is what solidified the long-term integrity of the entire system.
It really is a masterclass in the controlled use and retraction of state power. So let's try to distill this, the constitutional masterclass summary. This crisis seems to demonstrate 7 core principles of governance.
It does, and they've resonated for 14 centuries. 1. Law must serve life. Law is a tool for human welfare. If its fixed penalties undermine survival, they have to yield. 2. Emergency powers must be limited. They have to be targeted, temporary, and never arbitrary. They can't trample on pre-existing rights. 3. Universal welfare is a state duty. The state is obligated to ensure the basic survival of everyone under its protection using centralized resources. 4. Markets need moral oversight in a crisis. You can't let unregulated markets create exploitation. The state has to step in to enforce economic justice. 5. Legitimacy comes from shared sacrifice. A ruler's authority must be visibly aligned with the suffering of the people. 6. Federal or central solidarity. The wealthy, stable parts of a state must rescue the collapsing parts. It's a mandatory lifeline.
And 7, the one we just discussed, restoration of order. Temporary suspension of laws must never lead to their permanent distortion. The goal is always a swift return to the normal rule of law.
And when you lay out that blueprint, it becomes so clear that this isn't just history, it has profound contemporary relevance. We're facing global pandemics, climate disasters causing food shortages, economic collapses. We grapple with the exact same tensions.
The dilemmas are precisely the same as they were in 639 CE, just in a modern context. Think about the tension between public health lockdowns and their impact on people's livelihoods, or the need to balance border enforcement against the moral imperative to help climate refugees.
Or the debate over government intervention to stop price gouging on essential medicines.
Exactly. And this model from the Year of Ashes provides very specific, actionable advice for modern leaders. It gives us a clear framework. It dictates that during catastrophic stress, a state must have a legal framework that allows it to suspend punishment when moral choice is gone. It must be ready to prioritize food and survival over legal formalities, and to centralize supply chains to focus on need. And crucially, it shows that leaders must always commit to ending emergency powers on time to preserve long-term constitutional integrity.
An extraordinary, time-tested blueprint for leading through chaos while holding on to justice and mercy.
Which brings us to our final reflection. The Year of Ashes wasn't just a successful response to a natural disaster. It was the ultimate stress test of the moral and legal contract between a state and its people.
And what did that test prove about the nature of law itself?
It demonstrated that true strength in a legal system isn't found in its rigidity. It's found in its ability to adapt with compassion. To put it simply, the strongest law is the one that bends to save life and then stands upright again when the danger has passed.
Yeah.
The state didn't collapse. It transformed temporarily into a shelter, and that is leadership in its highest form.
An incredibly powerful deep dive. Thank you for that analysis. And for you, our listener, we'll leave you with a final thought to mull over. Think about modern constitutional models. How could they better integrate this concept of darura, of necessity, not just as a rare exception, but as a guiding principle? How can we structure our global or national systems to embed what you might call mercy as the highest form of law? How do we make sure that when the next crisis arrives, necessity drives compassion, not political opportunism? Next time on The Deep Dive, we pivot from crisis management to planning for stability. We'll be tackling constitutional succession crisis planning, Case 18, preventing chaos before it begins. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll talk to you next time.